In considering myself a Kagyupa, a follower of the Kagyu transmission of Buddhism, I consider myself an adherent of or a participant in this vast tradition which contains within it elements of the entire spectrum of the Buddhist teachings, on the level of the sutras, on the level of the tantras. And the study and the experience that I have gone through as a Kagyupa, as a follower of this particular school, has included this whole spectrum. Now, among all of the techniques, approaches, methods which are part of this mainstream Kagyu transmission, one of the most special, one of the most particular to the Kagyu line are the advanced practices known as the 6 doctrines of Naropa. Now, in the case of the teachings that we refer to as the Sutra tradition, the teachings of the Hinayana and Mahayana, these are held to originate from the time of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, to have been presented by that Buddha Shakyamuni. When we speak of the teachings of the Tantras, the particular level of enlightenment from which these teachings spring is generally held to be the Dharmakaya rather than the sublime Nirmanakaya, from what is known as Vajradhara in the Tantric tradition, which is not to say that it is anything different from the teachings of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. That is to say that these Nirmanakaya and Dharmakaya aspects are different aspects of the same state of enlightenment. And it should not be misconstrued to say that the teachings come from Dorje Changpa, that they do not come from Buddha. They do not originate from complete enlightenment. The particular vehicle or avenue of expression, however, is slightly different in that the Sutra teachings the Sutra tradition teachings are held to originate from this Nirmanakaya aspect of Shakyamuni, whereas the Tantric teachings originate from the Dharmakaya level of Vajradhara and the Sambhogakaya level of the various yidams or meditational divinities such as He Vajra, Chakrasambhara, Vajrayogini, and so forth. Now, in the term Kargyu in this school, Gyu means transmission or lineage, continuity, and the Ka means oral command, literally, oral instruction or oral command. What is implied most specifically by this term Kargyu is the direct line of transmission from the Dharmakaya level on the level of the Tantric teachings. It is this aspect of the transmission which characterizes the Kargyu, what we know as the Kargyu transmission, and hence the term oral transmission, direct oral transmission, refers most particularly to this line of teaching and experience which originates, we might say, which arises from the Dharmakaya level. Now, during the transmission and development of these teachings in the land of snows, in Tibet, the Central Asian plateau, these teachings, these tantric teachings, which ideally can provide the practitioner with the opportunity to attain complete enlightenment in a single lifetime, in a single body, or failing that in the bardo or after death state, or failing that within a significantly few number of future states of existence, these teachings were all generally referred to as Kargyu, as direct transmission of oral teachings. So in a certain sense, it would not be wrong to say that the term Kargyu implies, or at least at one time did imply, the entire spectrum of the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, the entire range of the teachings of what we know as the 8 major practicing lineages of the Tibetan tradition. The Nyingma school, what we now know as the Nyingmapa school, could be referred to and was often referred to as the Nyingma Kargyu, the oral transmission of the ancient tradition. The Sakyapa school as the Lamdre Kargyu, the oral transmission of the Lamdre teachings, which are the central cycle of teachings associated with this Sakyapa school. The Gelugpa school, known as the Gaden Kargyu, the oral transmission of Gaden Monastery, which was the major seat of this school during its development. The Jonongpa school, known as the Jonong Kargyu, named after the particular place, Jomonong, in Tibet, where this school was first established, the oral transmission of Jonong. The Shamba Kargyu, the oral transmission of the Lama from Shang, which is an area in Tsang, or south-central Tibet, which is where Trungpa Naljer was born and where he developed his school of the Shangba Kargyu, and so forth. This general name of Kargyu, only at a certain time did it take on the connotations of referring to one particular school among these 8. The common term we now use for the Kargyu school at one time was a far more broad spectrum term, referring to any case in which there was this direct oral transmission of tantric teachings that had been received by the Tibetans as a codified system. In the case of the Kargyu school in the more strict sense of the word, referring to what we now know as the Kargyu tradition, there are in fact sub-schools or sub-transmissions of this larger tradition which we refer to by their specific names. There are what are known as the 4 great schools of the Kargyu transmission, and these date from the time of the 4 major disciples of the great Gampopa. First and foremost among these was the first Gyawa Karmapa, Dusen Chemba, from whom arose the Karma Kargyu, the specific lineage we now know as the Karma Kargyu school. The 3 other disciples of Gampopa, from whom different schools arose, were the Shangtapa Tsundradrakpa, the Tsalpa Kargyu, which arose from the teacher whose name was Shangtsalpa Tsundradrakpa, the Baram Kargyu, which arose from the teachings of the student of Gampopa who was known as Barampa Dharma Wangchuk, and the Padru Kargyu, which arose from the teachings of Pamodrupa Dorje Jalpo. And so from the time of these 4 main disciples, heart sons of Gampopa, there came into being 4 distinct lines of transmission, distinct lines of teaching, which we refer to by these different names: Karma Kargyu, Tsalpa Kargyu, Baram Kargyu, and Padru Kargyu. We also refer to the 8 minor or secondary transmissions of the Kargyu system. These are specific lines of teaching, specific approaches which were developed by the 8 major students of Pamodrupa Dorje Jalpo, who in his own right founded one of the 4 great lines of transmission. In the case of this teacher, Pamodrupa, he had 8 major students, each of whom founded their own particular distinct lineage of teachings, distinct codification of the teachings which in general we know as the Kargyu, and therefore, in order to distinguish these one from the other, names were assigned to them: Drukpa Kargyu, Drigun Kargyu, Yapa Kargyu, Shungsep Kargyu, and so forth. All of these secondary schools then arose at the time of Pamodrupa from his 8 main students. Now, each one of these 4 major and 8 minor transmissions dates its ancestry to Marpa, Milarepa, and Gampopa. And so particular emphasis is placed upon the Mahamudra teachings as presented by those great teachers in founding the tradition of Kargyu as a whole, as a greater whole. In the case of each particular school, however, there is a certain approach or a certain codification of those teachings which is peculiar to that school. In the case of the Karma Kargyu, for example, there is a cycle of teachings known as the Kusum Motra, which is literally introduction to the 3 kayas, or pointing out the 3 kayas. And this is the particular way in which the Mahamudra experience and the meditation leading to that experience is presented in the Karma Kargyu school. In the case of the Drigun Kargyu, there is a system known as the Drigun Gongchik, Gongchik means something like unique intention, or the unified spirit or unified intention behind the Buddha's teachings as presented by the Drigling school, their particular understanding of and presentation of this approach. In the case of the Drukpa Karju, there is the cycle of teachings known as the Ronyam Kor Druk, the 6 cycles of equanimity. Ronyam means literally equal taste or equal flavor, referring to this, again, to this Mahamudra experience that what develops, and this is presented in a cycle of 6 different classes of teachings in the Drukpa school, and so forth. When one examines the distinct lineages, one will find that they have their own particular way of expressing what is essentially the same teaching that they derive from the same source. In the particular case of the lineage we are most familiar with, this is the lineage which began with the student of Gampopa, who was the first Gyawakarmapa, Dusan Chempa, whose student, in turn, was the first Situ Rinpoche, Situ Drogon Rächen. And these 2 gurus were the first in 2 incarnation series which became known as the Black Crown and the Red Crown Lamas of the Kagyu school, and principally due to the activity of these 2 incarnation lineages and the other lineage holders of the Kagyu school, this distinct transmission of the Karma Kagyu transmission has come down to the present day as an uninterrupted living lineage which is still accessible to students who wish to practice it. It's tempting to discover the origins of these teachings, which comprise the Kagyu presentation of Buddha Dharma, the Kagyu approach to practice. First and foremost, there is what is known as the short transmission, or the near transmission, which dates back in historical terms to the teacher Tilopa, who received directly from Vajradhara, directly from this Dharmakaya aspect, or Dharmakaya level, the inspiration and transmission of these teachings, which he then passed on to his principal student, another Indian whose name was Naropa, who in turn passed them on to his principal student, a Tibetan named Marpa the Translator, who in turn passed them on to his student, a Tibetan named Milarepa. In each of these cases, then, there was this direct oral transmission of the spirit of the teachings, the ultimate sense or ultimate experience of these teachings, along with the actual practices themselves. And this lineage is known as the proximate or near lineage, the one which originates with the Dharmakaya aspect of Vajradhara and continues through Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, and Milarepa among human beings. A more detailed lineage, a more extensive lineage for the same teachings is traced through other human teachers who predated Tilopa. Given that Tilopa also received this direct, authentic transmission from the Dharmakaya, he also received different mainstreams of transmission from human teachers, from human gurus, Mahasiddhas in India, from whom he received these teachings and then unifying them, codifying them, passed them on to Naropa, who passed them on to Marpa, and so forth. These are referred to as the four streams of transmission, and the image is of combining four rivers, a confluence of four rivers joining into one stream. And it is said that this was the activity of Tilopa and Naropa in joining together these four different main streams. Four because there are in fact four distinct lineages, and according to tradition they apply geographically to the north, west, east, and south of the Indian subcontinent. But the teachers holding these various transmissions lived in literally the four directions, in all directions in India, from whom Tilopa and in turn Naropa received these mainstreams of transmission from teachers such as Saraha and Shawaripa, from teachers such as Lawapa, from the teachers such as the Dakini Sukhasiddhi. These individual transmissions of the six doctrines were received and then codified by Tilopa into a system that was passed on to his student and became known by that student's name, the six doctrines of Naropa. It is this proximate lineage, though, directly from the Dharmakaya level to Tilopa that is most significant. In his own biography, Tilopa is quoted as saying, "I, Tilopa, have had no human teacher. My guru is Vajradhara." And so this direct transmission from the Dharmakaya level to that of Tilopa, the Nirmanakaya level of Tilopa, is the most significant one. And that is why when we recite lineage prayers, supplications to the gurus of the lineage in the Kargi school, this particular lineage is emphasized. This is the one to which most attention is drawn. For example, in the prayer known as the Dorji Chong Tunma, the short prayer to Vajradhara, the prayer begins, Vajradhara, Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, Gampopa, and the omniscient knower of the three times, the Karmapa, and so forth, and then continues with a general supplication to the Kargi lineage, emphasizing, therefore, this proximate transmission from the Dharmakaya level directly to Tilopa. In the case of this proximate lineage, then, from Vajradhara to Tilopa, Naropa, and so forth, there are particular texts which have come down in the tradition, which are taken as the bases for the transmission of these teachings, specifically the six doctrines of Naropa and the Mahamudra teachings of the Kargi school. In the case of the six yogas of Naropa, there is a system known as the perfectly pure command, and this is literal translation of the title, which is held to be the scriptural evidence, the scriptural codification of this direct transmission from Vajradhara and from Vajrayogini, from the Dharmakaya and Sambhogakaya levels to the Nirmanakaya level. In the case of the Mahamudra teachings, there is a particular tantra, which is referred to as the, literally, the incredible Mahamudra Tantra. And this is the text which is used as a basis for the codification of the Mahamudra teachings in this proximate lineage, then, from Vajradhara to Tilopa to Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, and so forth.
그는 사직고 리지다잖아. 그는 제가 도저히 괜찮아서 말로를 제 그래서 좀 살아하. 그는 바바로도 샤워를 봐. 나도 봐. 그는 마바 좀 지 사직이 모르겠다. 다시 그래야지.
좀 로더링신 사라하. 샤워를 안 마치고. There is a more extensive lineage for tracing the origin of the Mahamudra teachings, which again brings us back to the Dharmakaya aspect of Vajradhara, but the direct inspiration in this case is held to have taken place in the experience of the teacher known as Saraha, or rather, of a Bodhisattva, the Sambhogakaya level known as Loto Rinchen, from which it was received by Saraha, the Indian Mahasiddha Saraha. And from this transmission then of Vajradhara to Loto Rinchen to Saraha, the human lineage, from human individual to human individual, was transmitted from Saraha to Nagarjuna, from Nagarjuna to Shawaripa, from Shawaripa to Maitripa, and from Maitripa to Marpa. And so what are essentially the same teachings can be traced through another lineage which is longer, more extensive, going back several generations from Marpa, and therefore is referred to as the more extensive or longer lineage. In the case of the mudra or preliminary practices, these are known as the Mahamudra preliminaries. One is preparing oneself, as it were, for the practice of this approach known as the Mahamudra approach in the Kagyu school. For this purpose, when one is doing the Guru Yoga practice, the lineage which one supplicates is first and foremost this longer, more extensive lineage from Vajradhara through the Bodhisattva Loto Rinchen, through Saraha, Nagarjuna, Shawaripa, Maitripa, Marpa, and so forth. Now, it is common knowledge that Maitripa was one of Marpa's gurus, one of Marpa's most important gurus. However, it is also common knowledge that his most important guru was Naropa, the teacher from whom he received the most, and whom he considered personally his most important guru, his root guru, was Naropa. In his own writings, Marpa stated, Naropa, the glorious Naropa, was like the sun and the moon. Under him, there was the son of the victorious ones, Maitripa, indicating that Marpa himself considered both of these to be his gurus, but the most significant guru for him, the most important guru, was Naropa.
Tako chonde wala so. Sene te trouble is not cheap. Sene so tira the come over the chonde in the house. Sene chonde the court and the man that's what I pay. Sene paying a car corner so the papa there's a choke on that thing. And the budget take a job and then come and tell you nothing, that the choke on the party and take out the thing, like try to
In the case of Maitripa, this was someone who was associated with the great monastic university of Nalanda in Buddhist India. It would appear that he was quite a high-ranking scholar in this university, a professor in this university. He was a fully ordained monk, a bhikshu, and so on the outer level, he represented a model of spiritual practice in accordance with the Hinayana ideals of this particular kind of lifestyle, the monastic lifestyle as a model for spiritual practice. On the inner level, he was motivated by his bodhisattva vow of the Mahayana, and on a secret level, he was preserving his samaya, or tantra commitment, in Vajrayana practice. Now, this continued for some time, and all the time that he was conducting himself in his role as a monastic professor at this University of Nalanda, his inner realization was growing, to the point where, in his particular case, he began to use alcohol and the services of a consort as supports for his tantric practice. This was not something, however, that he made public, that he broadcast, but that he kept very secret, as is customary in these cases, so as not to encourage wrong views or doubts in the minds of people who were not prepared to understand what was taking place. At one point, the custodian of Nalanda University, whose job it was to maintain discipline and to assure the monastic authorities that all of the monks were keeping their discipline and that the order of the monastery was preserved. On one occasion, this custodian was making his rounds, and as he came into the room where Maitripa was sitting with his bowl of wine in front of him and his consort by his side, when he looked in, what he saw was a bowl of milk on the table and a bell, a drilbu or bell, sitting on the table. And so everything seemed fine, and out he went. Then at a certain point, he changed his mind and came back very quickly, and he was a little too quick for Maitripa this time, and found him sitting there with this bowl of wine in front of him and this young girl by his side. And so he said, well, I'm afraid this will never do. And reporting it to the authorities, they decided to expel Maitripa in disgrace. And so the monastic authorities ordered him, relieved of his post, ordered him to quit the monastery immediately. And so, quite merrily, taking his skin mat, a deer skin mat, and his bamboo staff, Maitripa went singing down to the banks of the Ganges and spread the mat out on top of the water and sat on it and poled himself across the Ganges, singing away with his bamboo pole sitting on this mat of skin. When everybody saw that, they realized that perhaps they'd made a little bit of a mistake. And in fact, this was the case of someone who did have realization. At that point, it was no longer any secret that Maitripa was a Mahasiddha, that he was a completely realized tantric master. Responsible for expelling Maitripa was Atisha, and once he realized his mistake, Atisha was horror-struck at what he had done, because in doing what he saw right within the context of the administrative order of the monastery, he had in fact slandered a great Mahasiddha, and he had attempted to humble or disgrace this enlightened being. And vis-a-vis his own karmic situation, he was extremely worried because this indicated a great obstacle for his practice. And so he confessed and acknowledged this fault and was attempting to purify himself of it. And when wondering best how to purify himself of this, he had a vision of Tara. And Tara spoke to him and said, the best way to purify yourself of this fault that you have committed is to go to Tibet, to the land of snows, to the land of darkness and barbarism, and reinstitute the pure teachings of the Lord Buddha. And if you do that, this will be the most significant way in which you can purify yourself. This seems to be, for Atisha, one of the most important personal factors that motivated him to go to Tibet. Maitrapa, following his expulsion from the monastery, Maitrapa, still with wine bowl and consort in attendance, went off into retreat and practiced for some time until he had a direct vision of his yidam, his divinity, in which he received instructions to seek out the teacher Shawaripa, another Mahasiddha living in India at that time. And the divinity in the vision indicated that he had a very strong karmic link from previous existences with this teacher Shawaripa, and that it would be extremely profitable for him, to say the least, to seek out this teacher, in that he would receive teachings from Shawaripa that would bring him to the ultimate realization in a single lifetime of full and complete Mahamudra realization. Now, Maitrapa sought out and found Shawaripa, but though he received initiations and instructions over a period of time from Shawaripa, it was certainly difficult, to say the least, for him to fully accept Shawaripa as an enlightened being and as his teacher. This would be explainable, no doubt, due to Shawaripa's rather eccentric behavior, because for one thing, he was always dressed extremely strangely. He used to go around in things like little skirts made of peacock feathers and very ornate clothing, but he had long, greasy, dirty hair full of lice. He was a hunter. He would have this bow that he would hunt with, in which he had impaled the corpse of a small pig that he had killed, and chopping the corpse in half, the upper part of the corpse was stuck on the top of the bow and the lower half on the bottom of the bow, and he would go around shooting deer with this bow and arrow. And when Maitrapa was in attendance upon Shawaripa, there were two girls who were Shawaripa's consorts, one on either side of him, who'd be going through his hair looking for the lice, and they'd all be eating these lice as they found them in his hair. And this, to say the least, caused some doubts in Maitrapa's mind. So while he was able to receive initiation and teaching from Shawaripa, he was not able to attain to full realization because he continued to harbor these doubts and hesitations about this eccentric teacher that he had managed to find. At a certain point, however, Maitripa was able to develop himself to the point where he got over these hesitations, was fully able to accept the teachings that he was receiving from Shauraripa, and then it was like one candle lighting another and the two flames becoming one. His realization and Shauraripa's were one and the same, and at that point Shauraripa passed on to Maitripa the formal transmission of the Mahamudra teachings. And so these two teachers, Shauraripa and Maitripa, figure in the longer transmission of the Mahamudra teachings that we were looking at earlier, from Vajradhara to the Bodhisattva Lodro Rinchen, to the Indian Mahasiddha Saraha, to Nagarjuna, to Shauraripa, and then to Maitripa, from whom it was passed on to Marpa. This teacher Maitripa of the Indian Tantric tradition was in fact instrumental in teaching, passing on lineages to a number of scholars and meditators from Tibetan transmission. First and foremost among these was Marpa the translator, to whom Maitripa gave this authentic transmission of the Mahamudra teachings. However, Maitripa also functioned as one of the most important and one of the kindest gurus of Trungpa Nalja, a Tibetan who founded the school known as the Shamba Karju in Tibet. The teachings which he gave to Trungpa Nalja were not only dealing with Mahamudra, but also with the six-armed form of Mahakala. Many of the teachings which form the cycle of these teachings of the six-armed Mahakala, Shadrupa, date from the time that Trungpa Nalja received them from this Indian teacher Maitripa, and then brought them back to Tibet to codify them as part of his Shamba system. Uninterrupted transmission from living teacher to living disciple, what is known as the Golden Rosary of the Kagyu transmission, which comes down to the present day with the late His Holiness the 16th Gyawa Karmapa Rangchung Rigpe Dorje. And this is a lineage which continues, which will continue into the future. In the future we will find names of such as the four great tulpas, their eminences Situ, Shamar, Jalsap, and Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoches, included in this lineage. One or another of these teachers certainly will take over the function as the principal lineage holder of the Golden Rosary of the Kagyu. And so it has not only come down to the present day, it is continuing and will continue on into the future as an uninterrupted line of transmission.
온 피스라서 봐, 온거 봐, 체질 봐, 롱거 봐, 되게 체질 봐, 단지 봐, 전화지 봐, 다 단지 끝내서는 맛이 다시나 챙기려서.
This golden rosary of the Kagyu school, then, represents a direct line of transmission on many levels. Particularly as regards the tantric teachings, there is an ongoing transmission of the empowerments, of the teachings, of the lungs or scriptural authorities, scriptural authorizations for these teachings. There is the formal transmission of the actual words and structure of the ceremonies and teachings. There is the transmission of the blessing and spiritual influence of these teachings. There is the transmission of the essential meaning behind and the ultimate experience of these teachings. All of these factors are important. All of these factors must be and have been preserved as uninterrupted, living transmissions down to the present day. The biographies of teachers before the first Karmapa's time, the teachers of the lineage up until that point, are quite well known in the West. Most people have had some exposure, at least, to the biographies of Naropa, Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, and Gampopa. In the case of the teachers from the time of the first Karmapa on, this is not always the case. The first Karmapa, whose name was Dusun Chempa, was given this name, literally the knower of 3 times, because of his omniscience, because of his unparalleled display of spontaneous psychic powers, miraculous powers, and the ability he could demonstrate to literally know past, present, and future. And because of this psychic power of his, which was so much in evidence during his life, he was named, by popular acclaim, as it were, Dusun Chempa, the knower of the 3 times. Now, his principal student became Situ Drogon Rächen, who is known to the tradition now as the first Situ Rinpoche, the first Situpa. Now, Drogon Rächen, Drogon means the protector of beings, the protector of living creatures, and Reichen means the great yogi. What it literally means is the great one who wears only a cotton cloth. Because Sita Dogen Reichen's practice concentrated upon what is known as tsalum in Tibetan, the use of the energy channels of the body, the nadis, and the subtle energy which moves in the bodies, in the configuration of the chakras and so forth, and using that subtle energy of the Vajra body through the practices such as Tummo, advanced Vajrayana practices. And he became extremely proficient and extremely skillful and adept at these practices. He also, unfortunately, developed some pride based upon this. He was quite proud of the fact that not only was he a tantric yogi, but that he had mastered all of these very advanced, very difficult to master practices. Now, Dusun Chempa at that point was extremely famous in Tibet because of the omniscience, because of the wisdom and psychic powers which he manifested. At a certain point, Sita Drogten Rinpoche heard of the fame of Dusun Chempa, and he decided it was about time to see just who was the most realized teacher in Tibet. And so he decided to go and challenge Dusun Chempa to something of a contest, just to see who in fact had the most realization, had the most skill in their practice. So he had to go rather a long way. Rinpoche said he went to an area in my own part of Tibet, in the eastern part of Tibet, a particular range of snow mountains where Dusun Chempa was in retreat. And he found Dusun Chempa in a cave in extremely primitive conditions. And when he first came in, Dusun Chempa said, "We've come such a long way, I'll have to make you a cup of soup." And he started to make this very thin, meager broth, and then he, when it was cooking away, he picked up an old finger joint from a corpse and started stirring the soup. And he said, "You know, normally I only just stir it once, but since you're such an honored guest who's come from such a long way, I'll stir it 3 times this time." And he just took this grotty old finger and began to stir the soup 3 times. Then Sita Rinpoche decided it was time to get down to business, and he said, "Well, what I've really come for is a contest. I want to challenge you to tsalam practice, to the advanced Vajrayana techniques, and see who is the most proficient, to see who's the best. Because I've heard so much about your fame, and I think I'm quite an adept too, and I want to see who is more famous." Dusun Chempa said, "Well, I'm getting a little old for that kind of thing. I have a student, however." His name is Batse Tadelwa, and he lives not far from here in a cave just up the road, just up the hill. And if you go up there and challenge him to a contest, that'll be sufficient. There's no need to put me to all that trouble. So he sent Sita Drogten Rinpoche further up the mountain to find this teacher, Batsa Tadelwa, in his cave.
마사다도와 나중 공사 천체가 공사됐잖아요. 치파도 차원이 키. 더 나만잖아. 야 치파도 야 치네. 그래서 그래 대가로 나오는데 근데 그래서 제가 생각을 지금 나가르잖아요. 근데 더 마사다도와 저러고 아유 엄마 너를 차를 써 맞아서 가능하겠어. 그래. 그래도 그 치차와서 가래 맞잖아. 그래 제가 너를 차버스 하랬어. 내가 나자 통화 차네. 나코로 소만한 데라고 그랬더니 그때 들라발았더니 따뜻한 사는 때는 저는 지금 도모만이 그 자리를 맞은 수말했어.
When Sita Dogen Rinchen came to the cave, he looked inside and it was empty. There was nobody there. So he went back down the hill and he said to Dusen Shenpa, well, I can't find Bhakta Tadewa. He's not in his cave. Dusen Shenpa said, are you sure? Go and have another look. I'm sure he's there. And he went back up to the cave and he looked in and there was a tiger there. He came back and he said, well, there's no person there. There's a tiger. And Dusen Shenpa said, no, he must be there. I know he's there. Go back and take another look. And he went back and looked in and there was a huge fire burning in the middle of the cave. He came back and he said, still no person, but there's something funny going on in that cave. There's a fire there this time. And Dusen Shenpa set him back up, and he went back up and found nothing but a pool of water in the middle of the cave. And while he was standing there wondering just what was going on, he idly picked up a pebble and threw it into the pond and went back to see Dusen Shenpa. He said, still nobody there. And Dusen Shenpa said, I'm absolutely sure if you go back one more time, he'll be there, because he's always there. That's his place where he stays. You go back up there and check. So he went back up and found a yogi sitting in meditation, holding in his lap the stone which he had thrown into the pond. So, fine and dandy. At last he met Bhakta Tadewa. So he went in and he said, I've been sent by your guru, Dusen Shenpa, and we're supposed to have a contest. I've come here to have a contest with him, and he insists you're supposed to stand in for him, and so now I want to have a Tummo contest with you. I want to see who's more proficient in Tummo. And Bhakta Tadewa said, fine. He said, there's a peak on this mountain not far away. If we climb up further, we'll get to the peak in this extremely cold wind and snow, extremely fine conditions for a Tummo practitioner. So up we go. So they started walking up the hill and up the mountain, and as they were climbing the peak, Bhakta Tadewa turned to Dogen Rinchen and he said, you know, I live around here. I'm kind of used to this climate, so I'll go right to the top. But you've come a long way. You're probably a little bit tired. Why don't you just stay on the slope here, just below, and then we'll both do our practice. And I'll be at the top of the mountain, and you be on the slope. After all, we don't want to strain you, having come such a long way. So Sita Dogen Rinchen agreed and sat down on the slope, and Bhakta Tadewa continued to climb until he reached the peak. And they sat down and began to practice, channeling their energy through the Tummo practice and generating the warmth of that practice. Now, Sita Dogen Rinchen was quite proficient. He was able to melt the snow on the mountain around him for several yards in circumference, or a radius of several yards around him in a huge circle. However, he was able to melt the snow but not heat the water. And so they practiced all night, and as much as he practiced, he still was shivering in this pool of cold water in the middle of the snow. Now, up at the top of the mountain, quite a ways up at the very peak, Bhakta Tadewa had managed not only to melt the snow for a bow shot, and the shot of the length of an arrow shot around him in a radius that large, but was keeping it boiling all night long. Not only that, but rather than letting it flow down the mountain, he was turning it back in on itself, so it continued to boil in this huge circle around him, and he was sitting quite happily in the middle of this boiling water. And in the morning, when their practice had continued all night, and the one had had his results and the other had had his results, they suddenly perceived Dusen Shenpa riding on a snow line in the sky in front of them. And Dusen Shenpa called down to his own student, Bhakta Tadewa, and he said, my other student down there, Sita Dogen Rinchen, seems to be suffering a little from the cold. Can you help him out? And at that point, the boiling water began to flow down the mountain in a river which surrounded Sita Dogen Rinchen and kept him quite comfortable from then on. All this was a very useful lesson to him because it humbled him, and he gave up the pride that he had had before, reasoning as he did that if the student was that good, what about the teacher? And at that point he was able to accept Duzin Shenpa completely as his teacher and receive authentic transmission from him. The transmission of the teachings in accordance with tradition, in accordance with the authentic presentation of the teachings of Mahamudra and the 6 yogas of Naropa, has taken place in much the same way from the time of the early forefathers of the lineage, such as Milarepa. And there has been this emphasis upon the maintenance of the tradition, of the authentic transmission and authentic methods used in order to generate the experiences for which these teachings were designed. In the case of the 3-month meditation retreat in Tibet, in the case of such a retreat associated with the Kagyu school, it was customary to commemorate the nirvana of Milarepa, the passing away of Milarepa, which is linked with the astrological calendar, falling as it does upon the 14th day of the first month of the Tibetan year. And what was customary during the Kagyu retreat, not during the first year, but during the second and third years of this retreat, was that everyone in the retreat would gather for this ceremony. They would wash, clean everything up very beautifully, arrange it very beautifully, and then wear nothing but thin white cotton garments during the dead of winter. This was during an extremely cold time of the year. And spend the night meditating upon Milarepa and singing the songs of the Kagyu Masters, the collection which has been translated as the Rain of Wisdom, the Kagyu Gurtso, or the Ocean of Songs of the Kagyu Masters. This would be chanted all night, and in the morning, before dawn, the yogis in the retreat would begin doing the trunkor exercises, the physical exercises associated with the 6 doctrines, particularly the Tummo practice. And this was the way that the anniversary of Milarepa's nirvana was commemorated during the 3-year retreat. At the end of a retreat, it was customary for the people who were leaving the retreat to come out wearing only this thin white cotton garment. And this, again, would be during a time of year when it was extremely cold. The people who were there as spectators would have frost on their mustaches and so forth because it was so cold. But the people who had come out of the retreat, due to the blessing, compassion, due to the energy that they had developed through this Tummo practice, the practice which they had done during the retreat, were quite comfortable in their thin cotton garments. And though this may seem a little like sensationalizing the teachings by having the people come out and do this, it was a way of demonstrating to people the obvious benefits, the obvious signs of practice, of the benefits of these teachings. And this was something which gave people great confidence, great faith in these teachings and in the practice of these teachings. This was quite a standard custom at the Kargyu retreat centers in Tibet. This is something which Lama Thupten and the other lamas here are aware of from their own personal experience, that this was a customary part of the retreat schedule. When the 3 or 3 month retreat center was established at His Holiness the Gyalwa Karmapa's seat in Rumtek Monastery, His Holiness insisted that the traditional, authentic transmission and customs of the Kargyu tradition be observed during this retreat as well. And he instructed the retreat master, the Venerable Bokurtuku Rinpoche, to follow the same regimen that would have been followed in Tibet, so that there was no break, no interruption of this transmission. And during this retreat, then, these people practiced in much the same way. And in order to commemorate Milarepa's Nirvana on the 12th month of the 12th day of the 14th day of the first month, they came out of the retreat dressed in only these cotton robes and performed a circumambulation of the entire grounds. And people who were there were extremely impressed by what had taken place. Now, all of these teachings then are still accessible, are still practiced in the way in which they were intended by the forefathers of the lineage. There are plans here for a 3 or 3 month retreat center to be established at the center of Samiling. And Rinpoche feels that, he says, I certainly intend to, if it is all possible, to be witness to the fact that the people in this retreat, clad in their simple cotton garments, will be braving the chills of Samiling's winter, which is by no means as cold as it was in Tibet. However, cold enough to assure us a spectacle well worth watching. In the case of the distinctive teachings of the Kargyu school, the cycle known as the Six Doctrines of Naropa is referred to as Taplam in Tibetan, which means the path of skillful means, the path employing many different skillful means. The Mahamudra approach is known as Dolam, the path of liberation, the path which liberates, a very direct approach, the shortcut, we might say. In the case of the Cherim, or Utpatikrama practices, the divinities upon which the Kargyu practitioner meditates, the 3 main yidams, or 3 main divinities of the school are Dojipamo, Vajravarahi, Kolo Demchok, and Gyalwa Gyamso.
그는 마바 말라 다터 생고 그는 라면아주 한바 동그레스 그 주들라 그는 저 까나바 지라도 한바 동그레스.
In the structure of the 3-year retreat, then, as envisaged by the Kagyu tradition, one begins with the preliminary practices. In the case of this retreat, then, one goes in and first meditates as intensively as possible on the ordinary or common foundations, which are known as the 4 thoughts, which turn the mind towards the practice of Dharma. This is the root of all of one's practice in retreat, and this is why particular attention is devoted in the beginning to establishing a firm basis of these different attitudes. Following this, one performs what are commonly known as the mundro, or preliminary practices, which are sometimes numbered as 4 when the prostrations and the taking of refuge are counted together because they are performed together, or sometimes counted as 5 when one separates these two and considers the 100,000 prostrations as one practice, and at the same time the 100,000 refuge prayers as another practice, and then the 100-syllable mantra, Vajrasattva, the mandala offerings, and the Guru Yoga forming the other 3. So the next stage of the practice, following these 4 contemplations, are the preliminary practices. These are the preliminary practices. Following which, as an extension of the Guru Yoga practice, one meditates upon the various figures of the lineage with whom specific Guru Yogas have become associated. That is to say, with Marpa the translator, with the Venerable Milarepa, with the great Gampopa, and with the second Karmapa, Karmapakshi. During the practice of the prostrations and the refuge prayer, one finishes every tune or every session of meditation with the retaking of the Bodhisattva vow, the personal reinforcement of one's Bodhisattva vow and Bodhicitta prayers. So this forms an ongoing element in one's practice from the very beginning. On a daily basis, several times a day, one is reinforcing this Bodhisattva vow. However, it is still necessary on a more formal level of practice to generate and develop this quality of bodhicitta. And so following the ladrups, as they are called, the guru sadhanas of Marpa, Milarepa, Gampopa, and Karmapakshi, one continues with a particular series of teachings and meditations known as lojong in Tibetan, the training of the mind, which has become well known in the West as the mind training in 7 points and so forth. This whole cycle of lojong teachings is practiced at this point after the Guru Sadhanas. These lojong teachings are in fact one of the main bases of practice in a school that was known as the Kadampa school, which began at the time of Atisha. And in fact this Kadampa school is considered as a separate practicing lineage from the mainstream Kagyu transmission. However, the great Gampopa's early training took place within this Kadampa system. And in fact, the particular genius of his activity is held to have been the combining of the experience and knowledge he received from the Kadampa tradition with his tantric practice under the tutelage of Milarepa. The traditional phrase to describe this is that he blended the 2 rivers of Kadampa and Mahamudra, and he brought these 2 into a mainstream transmission, which we now know as the Kagyu school. And so the Kagyu school has always laid emphasis upon these Kadampa roots of the great Gampopa and the training and meditation that he did while involved in that tradition.
tené nasu tsuma tené nandala mbede da tela sabji tené nongo leda tené kapchu sejinda gamaya tenda jirin hichinda nancha deri indan kela chebate samato inza tené nanda sano solo nanda soso ta chebrjeni jodwa inza tené nanda ne dangwa sente tené laso shosala tené je chara masha tenale nongres.
Beginning with the practice of mandala offering in the preliminaries, one begins the daily practice of the practice known as chut in Tibetan, the cutting through teachings. These are part of a cycle which is again considered one of a separate practicing lineage among the 8 from the Kagyu school. It was developed most extensively in Tibet by an Indian teacher whose name was Padampa or Pachik, the only father, Dampa Sonje, and a Tibetan woman whose name was the only mother, Lapchi Drunma, Machik Lapchi Drunma. However, this chut teaching and chut practice is incorporated into the Kagyu system of 3 or 3 month retreat because it is a significant embellishment and deepening of the mandala practice. The mandala offering is, we might say, the outer level of offering. One is offering the entire universe, the external physical world, and thus developing one's merit, deepening one's awareness through this process of offering the physical world, the physical universe as a basis. The chut practice is a more inner level because one is here concerned through meditation with transforming one's physical body, a far more intimate level of one's experience, into an offering which is employed in various ways during the meditation. It is offered to what are known as the 4 guests, or the 4 kinds of guests. The first of these are the sources of refuge, the 3 jewels and 3 roots, as the objects of one's faith and devotion, as the objects of one's respect and service that one is rendering through this offering. There are the Dharma protectors, specifically referred to as the guests embodying the qualities, positive qualities of the path. There are all sentient beings, considered as the fitting objects for one's compassion in making this donation, as it were, this charitable donation or generous donation of the body through meditation. And there are the beings with whom one specifically has negative karmic debts. These are one's karmic creditors, as it were. These are beings with whom one has established a negative karmic connection through what one has done in the past, in previous lifetimes, for which one will ultimately pay in the future, through some means or another, the karmic retribution being yet to come. And it is an act of generosity to these karmic creditors that one offers the body in meditation. And so the general spirit behind the meditation is the same. It is one of offering. The point is that the mandala offering represents a more outer, exterior level, a more public level, we might say, whereas the chut practice represents a more secret, a more intimate or inner level of that offering process. And therefore it is used, or it is begun at the same time as the mandala practice, and in fact is carried on after the mandala practice stops, after the 1 month or so that the mandala practice is done. The chut practice is carried on an uninterrupted daily basis until the end of the 3 or 3 month retreat, in order to embellish this process of offering as a means of generating merit and deepening one's awareness. Following this, one embarks upon the main body of tantric practice, the Utpatakrama and Sampanakrama practices, the stages of development and completion in meditation, beginning with the Yidam practices, the divinities such as Chakrasambhara and Vajrayogini, upon which one meditates using the different stages, the outer, the inner, and the secret stages of the practices in their proper order, performed according to the traditional presentation of these teachings, one after the other, in a successive cycle.
또만 저 때는 내가 산적들이 말 잡아도 다 저어가고 그랬어. 또 많이 파네.
On a Hinayana level of practice, the emphasis is laid upon the emptiness of the mind. The Buddha's statement that mind in and of itself is uncontrived. Mind is by nature emptiness, shunyata. Using that as a basis, understanding that as the fundamental nature of the mind, one begins to develop a one-pointed, focused state of concentration through one's meditative practice, which allows one to directly experience that emptiness of the mind. In the case of the Mahayana teachings, this is embellished with the quote from the Buddha that mind, yes, mind is uncontrived, but mind is by its nature luminosity, lucidity, clarity. And so there is the point that not only is the mind essentially empty, but that it exhibits a lucidity or clarity as its nature, its ability to know anything, its potential to experience anything. This is then the basis for meditation in the Mahayana, the experience of the simultaneity of this emptiness and lucidity of the mind. And in fact, the Mahayana carries this further and says, if there is emptiness and clarity to be experienced, then it follows that we must speak of this experience or this ability of the mind not only to have the potential to experience, but to actually experience, to actually manifest as experience. We need to consider this a third aspect in order to describe as completely and as accurately as possible the nature of mind. And various names, any of which will suffice, are given to this quality of mind, which is its cognitive aspect, which is its intelligent awareness, which is its unimpeded or dynamic manifestation. There are many names used in the text, all of which are more or less synonymous. And what this refers to then is the Mahayana view that the mind, the nature of mind itself, in order to be described as accurately and as completely as possible within the limitations of language, is described as essentially empty, clear and luminous by nature, and dynamic and unimpeded in manifestation. In describing then the mind as empty, lucid, dynamic, and unimpeded, the Mahayana speaks of this as the cause of enlightenment and as the result, as enlightenment itself. It is the potential which is actualized through the attainment of enlightenment. Rather, the attainment of enlightenment is the actualization of that potential. And this is the understanding then of the quote. This is how the quote from the Tantra should be understood, which says, all sentient beings are Buddha, but incidental obscurations obscure this fact. Once the incidental obscurations are removed, the potential becomes actualized. What is latent now becomes actual, becomes reality, becomes the actual experience. So this is seen then as the potential for enlightenment in the mind of each and every being, which is simply there to be discovered, to be uncovered, discovered, to be actualized.
되네. 저 손이 저기 서라고 들고 파트가 뻥기다 치는 데서 나와야지. 저서나 너가 참여도 좀 파네. 또 많이 좀 봐야 돼. 그래 잡아 쳐볼 때는 하지 말아야지. 가르쳐나 네 나서 거인 봐 터치 산적 화사자 주디 근데 다다 내는 나루빠가 또 많이 참여를 해서네. pen pioneers, but also one budget about anything, how and the Siddharth Patrick the Master Suarez.
People should look on a do temporary to temporary between the bottom, so many
Tada, Panatoba. Teva member, Rinpoche, Gita, and what's on just some Rogi, then a boat to bicycle. The British elders, then you the Charab Dan Pane, going out of the domain in the artist,
people dream with people dream with it.
Then Tabatamolata, Buddha, Patches, and out of one out of the Chubanda Sintalis in it, and Piralis. Then it's all about it to give me half of that Piralis.
Now, in examining the nature of mind itself, the ultimate nature, fundamental nature of mind, the different yanas, the different levels of practice may not differ very much at all, particularly in the cases of the Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings. They do not really differ at all significantly in how they describe the nature of mind. What is significantly different is how they describe the nature of body, of the physical embodiment. In the case of the Hinayana, if we divide this into the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddha paths, on the Shravaka path, the physical body is presented as something impure, disgusting, something composed of many impure substances. There is a traditional list of 32 impure substances which compose the physical body, and the body is analyzed in meditation in order to generate a feeling of disgust or disinterest in the body as something so impure, as something so corruptible. In the case of the Pratyeka Buddhayana, the approach is rather to reduce the body to its atomic and subatomic components, to simply reduce the body in meditation to these particles which compose the physical body, to discover that the physical body in and of itself is empty. It is no thing in and of itself. It is merely a collection of different aggregates. It is a collection of various kinds of particles in a certain configuration, and nothing more, nothing less than that. In the case of the Mahayana teachings, the attempt is to see the body, to see all phenomena as dreamlike, as illusory, as like reflections, like mirages, like hallucinations, as merely projections of mind with no ultimate reality in and of themselves, beyond the reality that the mind ascribes to them. In the case of the Vajrayana, one speaks of the body as the form of the divinity. The sacred or divine nature of physical embodiment is accentuated in the Tantric teachings. In order to present this experience of the sacred nature of physical embodiment, the sacred nature of the phenomenal world, to the student, the different divinities are used in meditation, the different stages of what is called Cherim in Tibetan, or Utpatakrama in Sanskrit, the stage of development or creation in meditation. So the meditation upon the forms such as Chakrasambhara, Vajrayogini, or whatever, are to introduce the student to this experience of the sacred in the physical body, the mind as embodied in physical form in a phenomenal world. One of the other main divinities besides Chakrasambhara and Vajrayogini used in the Kagyu school is Gyalgyamso. And this practice may be done before the 6 yogas are introduced into the regimen of the retreat, or it may be done afterwards. normally the practices of Chakrasambhara and Vajrayogini are done before the 6 yogas, but the practice of Jiao Jumps may be done either before or after, depending upon the particular wishes of the retreat masters. In order to extend and enrich the experience that one develops through the Utpatakrama practices, these meditations upon the divinities and the use of mantra and so forth, this is extended through what is known as Sampanakrama, the stage of fulfillment or completion. This has two aspects. One is a formal aspect, that is to say it employs form and structure in visualization and so forth, and the other is a completely formless approach. The formal approach of Sampanakrama is the cycle of teachings known as the 6 doctrines of Naropa, most particularly for the Kagyu school at least. In the case of the formless approach, this is the Mahamudra. These are the Mahamudra teachings. All of these practices, then, represent, on the one hand, different elements in a whole spectrum of practice, from beginning to end. They are designed to be approached either in this way, one after the other in a proper succession, or any one of them may be taken from context and used as the main practice. The benefits of these kinds of practices are not only do they fit into this scheme or spectrum of practice, but in and of themselves, they constitute complete practices, which theoretically at least can enlighten any given practitioner who involves him or herself with those practices. We are extremely fortunate then to be in a situation where we have access to any and all of these practices under the proper circumstances in order to practice them. We can consider ourselves in the situation of someone who has arrived at the mythical island of jewels. They have just arrived at this place of incredible wealth and incredible beauty, and they can have whatever they want. They have arrived at a place that can fulfill their wildest dreams. In this case, we're talking about a material example of jewels, but we're speaking of a spiritual example as well. We have arrived at the point where we have this wealth available to us, and we quite literally can have whatever we want. If we are willing to approach the practices in the way that they are intended, we may practice whichever of these practices we wish. This should be a cause for joy. We should continually remind ourselves that we are in this extremely fortunate, extremely wonderful position. Perhaps with that as the concluding note, we can dedicate the merit of this morning session for the benefit of all beings.